Welcome back. In teaching, this kind of sort of slot is what we call the death slot or the slumber slot. It's the awful one when you're teaching people immediately after lunch and they've already had some sessions and they've had their lunch and they're starting to feel sleepy and drowsy. And so I'm going to do my best to keep you awake. If you fall asleep, don't feel guilty. It's my fault, not yours, all right? Because I wasn't engaging enough or didn't shout loud enough to keep you awake. So if you drift off, don't worry about it. But I hope you'll stay awake because we're moving into what is it, in a sense, the second part of our overall picture for the weekend, declaring God's glory in the church and in the world. And our focus so far has been on in the church, and we've reflected on worship and what that means and what that might look like, and how we can better reflect on and practice the act of declaring God's glory. We're moving this afternoon into the second part, declaring God's glory in the world. And what this brings us to is the second of our two major activities, the activity of evangelism. Now, I'm going to put you to work right at the outset because I'm going to ask a question, and then I'd like you just for a couple of minutes around your tables just to kind of discuss this. Which is more important, worship or evangelism? These are two of the central activities in which we as Christians are called to engage, in which we as the church should be, committed, and in which we should be involved. And notwithstanding my remarks at the end of this morning's session about worship continuing into eternity, we're not in eternity yet, we're still here on earth. As we are here on earth, which is more important, worship or evangelism? Just take a couple of minutes to discuss that, if you will, around your tables. Okay, let's see what we've got, shall we? Let me just do a quick straw poll, not by table, but by individual, because you might have disagreed around your table. How many people think worship is more important? How many people think evangelism is more important? And what about the rest of you? So let's get a bit of feedback now. So any comments anybody wants to offer? They're both as important as each other, so you can't decide between them, okay? Was that the kind of general feel that was coming out? Can't have one without the other?
Evangelism is a demonstration of worship.
Very good, thank you. I want to come back on the comment, can't have one without the other. You are actually right, except lots of people and lots of churches do. Strictly speaking, you can't when we understand them rightly, but in practice, it is not uncommon to find one without the other. Okay, well, I'm going to make my declaration now. And I'm going to suggest to you that the most important is worship. Now, for reasons that I'm going to unpack and explain, and in the end, it's a kind of notional thing, because this isn't about which one should we do over against the other. And in that respect, the kind of general view that both are equally important has a lot of practical validity, if you like. But let me read you a quotation from John Piper's book, Let the Nations Be Glad. And if you want to get hold of a fabulous book it's essentially a book about the supremacy, the superiority of God. The subtitle is The Supremacy of God in Missions, and the primary thrust of the book is missions, or if you like, evangelism. However, it has quite a bit to say about worship as well and how the two relate. And he actually kicks off the book with these words: missions is not the ultimate goal of the church. Worship is. And then he makes his famous statement, one that's been quoted very often and very widely. Missions exists because worship doesn't. Worship, he goes on to say, is ultimate, not missions, because God is ultimate, not man. When this age is over and the countless millions of the redeemed fall on their faces before the throne of God, missions will be no more. It is a temporary necessity, but worship abides forever. Now, touched on that this morning, but this isn't simply about worship is the supreme one because it will go on longer. It's the supreme one because it is the supreme one because ultimately it's all about worship. Just step back for a moment and think about God's creation, his creation of the universe, his creation of human beings. Why did he create us? He created us for himself, and the Reformed statement, the Westminster Confession of Faith, said that the supreme end of man, i.e. men and women, human beings, is to worship God and glorify him forever. John Stott once wrote beautifully, God made us for himself, and we are never more human than when we are on our knees before our Creator. It's what we're made for. We are made for worship, and the tragedy of the fall is that our forebears, Adam and Eve, chose to go their own way and strike independence from God rather than worshipping him fully, truly, in obedience. And so you can argue that the very first sin, the sin that has introduced sin into the world, into our world, is actually a sin of worship or failure to worship, the sin of idolatry. So worship lies at the heart of who we are, what we are created for, what God intends for us in his purposes. And therefore, to fail to worship God is the ultimate denial, not just of God, which it is, but also of our fundamental humanity. So the point that John Piper makes here is that the goal of mission is to produce worshippers. It's another way, in some respects, of saying it's to produce disciples, because disciples are inherently, inescapably, worshippers. So the goal of missions is to bring people to a knowledge of God, to saving faith in Jesus Christ, as a result of which they will become worshippers. So when we engage in evangelism, we may not always think of it intentionally in these terms. We certainly are not likely to frame it in these words, but our goal, and we need to understand this, is to make worshippers of God. So missions is not the ultimate goal of the church, it's a means to an end. Missions is a means to an end, and the end, the result, the goal is that people will worship God. And that's why Piper goes on to say missions exists because worship doesn't. So worship, there is a strong case to be made for worship being the supreme activity. Now, great. Does that mean that we focus exclusively on worship, that we focus more on worship than on mission and evangelism? No, it doesn't. And here I want to throw out a challenge, because we've already reflected on the journey of the last 40, 50 years and the extent to which worship has come much more on the agenda. People weren't really thinking about worship some decades ago. When I started teaching on worship, which was in the late 90s, I had never before seriously thought about worship. I have to say, I went to a new post at London School of Theology. They were setting up a new course on theology, music, and worship, and I was asked to teach the theology of worship. And sometimes lecturers, we never admit it to our students, but sometimes we're kind of just a step ahead of our students. We're kind of learning and teaching. Well, trust me, that first year I was about a quarter of a step ahead of my students. I was learning on the hoof as I went, studying something I'd never studied, never seriously thought about before, wasn't taught it at Bible college, and suddenly I was teaching theology of worship. I spent 16 years doing it, so by the end I knew a thing or two and was maybe a step or two ahead of my students by that time. But I say that just to show that that worship wasn't on the agenda. By the time I first taught worship at LST, as it now is, I'd been to Bible college. I had a couple of degrees in theology. I'd been a missionary in France. I'd been a pastor. I'd already been teaching elsewhere, and I'd been a principal of a college. And I can stand here and tell you I had never in my life, up until that point, seriously thought about worship. Why? People didn't. That's changed. Not only London School of Theology has a whole degree program that involves worship built into it. But even where that isn't the case, worship is much more likely to feature on the curriculum these days. And when I started teaching, there were kind of a handful of books. Now there are dozens, hundreds of them that have come out in the last 20, 30 years. Now people are talking about worship, people are thinking about worship, people are writing about worship. And it's come much more to the forefront, so much so, and this is where I want to land, so much so that I suggest to you we have become overly preoccupied with worship. I'm currently just finishing a book. I wrote it once and then I've had to rewrite it on worship and evangelism, which is what's really given me the heart to share this particular topic in this way with you this weekend. And the journey has been a really interesting one for me because I am something of a worship specialist, if you like. I've taught it for 20 years or more now. And I've never, ever taught mission. I did teach evangelism for 2 or 3 years at LST, just one course. But mission, evangelism, has never been my area of specialization. And I've had to do some extra work in writing this book and creating a genuine fusion between the two. And my journey has been very interesting because I've come to a point in the last couple of years where I've come to see that in my own life and ministry, I have so focused on worship that I have been neglectful of mission and evangelism. That's okay on one level in terms of teaching and the specialisms. Nobody teaches everything, that's fine. But I want to go on the back of that to suggest to you that this is where the church has ended up. We, in the journey that I summarized very briefly to you this morning, have come to a point where worship has become a big thing. There's a whole worship industry out there, both musically, but also in writing, in worship conferences, in worship workshops, and we think a great deal more about our worship. Now, in and of itself, that's a good thing. But it seems to me that there is a danger of undue introspection that is involved in a lot of that journey and thinking, because, and we touched on this morning, one of the shifts that's happened is that in our focus on worship, we have actually dumbed down in many ways to center on ourselves. We've become what's called anthropological, human-centered, instead of God-centered. We've taken the focus off God, put it on ourselves in many ways. I'm not going to go over that ground again. And it feeds into the rampant individualism that's firmly entrenched now in our contemporary society. We live in an individualistic society. Individualism is right, and it becomes all about me, myself, and I, and linked to that, a consumerism that offers us choice. And so people church hop, and if they don't like the music or the worship in one church, they'll hive off to another one and another one. And we act like consumers, going around the shops and looking at the different ones and seeing which product we like that we will then buy, or in this case of worship, buy into. And that's the downside of this overfocus on worship. And alongside that, I want to suggest to you that we have too often lost sight of the outward look, which is a true and proper part of worship, namely the world. So declaring God's glory in the church, so vital, so important. Declaring God's glory in the world, also so vital, so important, but I'm going to add, so neglected. So I could ask a question, and this is a rhetorical one that I don't ask for any outward answers to, but I could say, when did you last worship? You might even say, well, today we've shared in worship together amongst the things that we're doing. I can ask you another question. When did you last tell somebody about Jesus Christ? When did you last, to use then the technical term, evangelize? And I suspect many of us would have to think a bit longer and harder about when that last was. I include myself in that count. It's something God has challenged me with very greatly and deeply. In recent days, I've been involved in Christian ministry for over 40 years. But in these latter years, well, not just latter, but for a number of decades, my focus has been on teaching Christian believers, which is what God has called me to and is vital and important. But if I'm really honest, I have at times lost sight of my calling to be an evangelist and on the importance of evangelism. So what I want us to do is reflect on this all-important area of evangelism, which needs to sit alongside our worship and be related to it. Let me just make the link before I then have some things I want to share about evangelism itself. Declaring God's glory in the church and in the world, these are not two distinct, separate things. They are related things. What is it primarily that relates them and holds them together? Well, I can answer that in one word. And that word is God. God holds them together. And let me explain why. God holds them together because the God that we worship is what I'm going to call a missional God. That is to say, a God who is engaged in mission. People have been writing about mission for decades, centuries even. But one of the things that in the last 50, 60 years has changed dramatically amongst those who are some of the leading thinkers and writers in the area of mission is the recognition that God does not just call us, his people, to mission. He calls us, his people, to be involved with him in his mission. Because God, our God, is a God who is on mission. Our God is a God who has a mission. The word mission comes from words that mean sending. Well, who is the first one who sends? God. What does God do? John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. The word send is not there, but the word gave, that giving involves a sending. Jesus actually says on one occasion, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. So we're kind of second order sendees, or those who are being sent. God himself has a mission to redeem and restore the world to himself. That's the whole story of the Bible. The big story of the Bible, from Genesis 3 onwards, when the fall occurs, is the story of God redeeming humanity to himself. And that's why he calls out a people in the Old Testament under Abraham, who incidentally themselves were called to be a mission people, a light to the Gentiles. So even in the Old Testament, God's people were called to be missionaries, if you like, or evangelists in that sense. And then once we hit the New Testament, Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. And of course, the other sending on the part of God is the sending of his Spirit to equip and empower us for the work that he's calling us to do. So when we go in mission, when we go out in evangelism, and the words go out are metaphorical because I might actually be talking to the person next to me, I might not need to go anyway. When we engage in mission or in evangelism, we are sharing in the mission that is God's mission. So, when we worship God and understand him rightly to be a God of mission, we cannot escape being drawn into mission. And contrary to our worship being or becoming introspective navel gazing, focusing on ourselves, number one, we need to be focusing on God. Number two, we need to be focusing on one another, that horizontal axis of sharing together. And number three, we need to be focusing on the world outside, which is God's world, for which he has a heart, for which he has a mission, for which Jesus Christ died. So I'm going to go as far as to suggest that we cannot worship God truly without an engagement in mission. John Piper, in his excellent book, and incidentally it's not a big book, it's about 100 and something pages, and it's a very readable book, very challenging book in many ways, but a very helpful book. John Piper goes on to say that worship is the fuel and goal, mission is the fuel, worship is the fuel and goal of mission. So that's the right way. Worship is the fuel and goal of mission, because when we worship God and we acknowledge him for who he is, and our heart begins to beat in tune with his heart, which is a heart of mission, a heart for the world, we are going to be fired up to do mission. So in that sense, mission is fueled. It's not the only place, it's not the only context, and it's not the only purpose in that sense of worship. Our primary purpose is simply to acknowledge and respond to God. But when we do that, we're going to be taken up with who God is and his purposes and his desires and his heart. And God's heart beats for the world. And if we miss that, we've not worshipped. So within our worship, there needs to be an understanding of these things, and perhaps a little bit more intentionality in some of the ways we frame our worship and express our worship, which draws us into the world. The danger is that we come aside from the world. Sometimes people will say, and in years gone by, I've said it myself, you start at the service, you're leading a service, and you say, as we gather, let's put everything aside. Let's forget everything else and let's bring our focus on God. That's nonsense, frankly. Because God is there in the midst of everything. God is in the world. And God is with us in the world. And the danger is we end up with this mentality of detachment. God doesn't call us out of the world. Jesus says you are in the world, but you're not of the world. So we are separate in some regards. We are different. We are called to be different. We're called to live in a different way, in a way that people will see and say, why is it that you react in the way that you do? Why is it that you don't get involved in these dubious financial practices? Why is it that, all of those things that we ought to be and do? Because they see the difference. And that's the reality of the outworking of our faith in the world. And so we need to be different in those regards. Not different in a standoffish way. Not different in a way that we fail to engage with those around us who need to hear the gospel, the good news that Jesus Christ died for them, that their lives are broken and damaged. But there is hope. There is only one hope in this world. It is the hope of Jesus Christ, died, risen, ascended, glorified, and offering us salvation. So we need to be engaged in that way. And we need to have that difference, but not in a way that separates us, in a way that allows us to engage. We are in the world. And when we come to worship, we're not cutting ourselves off from the world, or at least we shouldn't be. We should be, because we come to worship a God who loves this world, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And so we need to tune in to God's wavelength and understand the needs of the world and cry out to God for those needs in our prayers and reflect on them in some of the aspects of our service and leave our times of worship ready to engage afresh with the world, because God has been at work transforming us. We said this morning that worship isn't about just being blessed, having a great time and going out and saying, wasn't that nice? Well, in some ways, this is an extension of that. As I engage with God and he meets with me wherever I am, whatever I need, and yes, he will encourage me. Yes, he will bless me. Yes, he will pick me up when I need picking up. Yes, he'll break me when I need to be broken. Yes, he'll challenge me when I need to be challenged. He'll restore me when I need to be restored. But whatever is going on, we are being restored and redeemed and transformed in our worship of God. And part of that transformation will be to reignite us in our passion for the things that God is passionate about. And the thing God is most passionate about is the people he's created. So worship needs to engage us in that way, and in that respect, worship is the fuel of mission. It's also the goal of mission, as we've already said. What is the end product, if we can use that term? It is worshippers. So worship is what mission is setting out to bring about and achieve. And on these two fronts, we need to have that engagement. And you see how declaring God's glory in the church and in the world are not ultimately two separate things. That they are related. And the high point of that relationship is in the very God we come to worship. So that's an important foundation for us to understand and appreciate. And one of the drifts of a lot of our worship in recent days, and by recent time, I'm not talking just the last year or two, over a whole period, has been to shift the focus onto ourselves on the one hand and onto this kind of inward looking on the other, where we need to have that outward look in our worship that sends us out, that thrusts us out to proclaim Jesus. So declaring God's glory in the world, in the activity of evangelism. Now, what does that mean for us practically? Well, of course, evangelism, that's for the experts. That's for the evangelists. And there is that passage in Ephesians 4 that tells us that God has given gifts to the church, apostles and teachers and prophets and evangelists and pastors, teachers. So if you're called to be an evangelist, then you need to get out there and do the job. And God bless you, we'll pray for you. Well, that's not actually the New Testament perspective. Let me change the word, if I may, from evangelist to witnesses. We are all called to be witnesses. Those who witness or testify to Jesus Christ. Friends, that's evangelism. So on the one hand, there are specialists, if you like, trained, equipped, gifted people who are evangelists. You think of somebody like Billy Graham. And perhaps more recently, somebody like Louis Palau. These world-renowned people who have a calling and who have this amazing gifting of being an evangelist. Well, that's, if you like, evangelist with a capital E. And we're not all called in that way. I'm not an evangelist of that kind. It's not my primary gifting at all. But what I and you are called to be is an evangelist with a small e, if you like. In the same way that we are all called to be disciples of Jesus, and we talked about this yesterday evening, we are all called as an expression of that discipleship to be witnesses. That is, evangelists. No one is exempt. But it's just not my personality, it's not my temperament. I don't find it easy to speak with people. It's just not me. I'm just not there. I'm just not able. Do you not love Jesus Christ enough to want to talk about him? Do you not love people enough in their lostness to want them to hear this good news? There are all kinds of ways in which we can share, and we may all do it differently in our different contexts and with our different personalities and temperaments and experience. But unless you can't talk, you can talk about Jesus. We will talk about anything and everything else that interests us, that excites us. I have a bit of a reputation in my family because I love football. And for better or for worse, I am a Leeds United fan. I grew up near Leeds, and a lot of the time it's a great travail, it's a great burden, because we never seem to be achieving quite what we should achieve. So it's a lot of agony and angst along the way. And whenever Leeds are playing, and certainly if they're on television and I get a chance to watch them, my wife desperately hopes Leeds win. She doesn't really care about Leeds, but she knows if they lose, I'm not going to be in quite such a good frame, But the upside is, you get me talking about Leeds, and I get passionate, and I get excited, and I'll talk to anybody, and I'll preach Leeds. Why? Because it's something that I am passionate about. Now, we've all got things that we are interested in. We've all got things that we are passionate about. We might get passionate in different ways. Some people are very quiet, gentle, and they never get overly excited. This isn't about needing to get excited. It's just being passionate enough to want to talk about something. It might be cooking. It might be baking. It might be a program on television. It might be, pets, animals, dogs, whatever it is. We've got those things that we're happy to talk about. And all I want to suggest to you is we need to be passionate enough about Jesus to want to talk about him. Friends, that's evangelism. Evangelism is simply sharing the good news, and it is good news, and boy, do we need good news in our world today. We live in a troubled world, do we not? News that is dominated by national crises and catastrophes and wars, economic problems and challenges, social disruption and problems and scandals of one kind or another. We live in a desperately troubled, broken world. And you know what? You and I have the answer. Or we know what the answer is. The answer is in Jesus Christ and in the hope that he brings. And sometimes we may find just simple opportunities to share with others, even in a conversation. You're standing in a shop queue, and people do sometimes talk, and they get talking, oh gosh, isn't it terrible what's happening, so on. Well, okay, we can chat about that. We say, yes, those things are awful, and I'm just glad that I have a hope that takes me beyond those things. Jesus Christ. Now, some people will then, it's clear, they don't want to talk, they'll put the shutters up. It's fine, you can't go in it. But sometimes people will say, oh, really? Tell me more. So it's learning to take the opportunities that come our way. Praying for opportunities, praying for our families, our friends, those who don't know Jesus Christ. The first two things we need are, one, a passion for Jesus Christ, and the good news of salvation in him. And number two, a passion for those in the world, and not least those that we know who do not know Jesus Christ, and who genuinely, truly are living and dying without hope. So let me share something very practical with you now. I want to talk to you about something called Advance. Advance is an organization that has been set up. It was started by Andy Hawthorne, who is the CEO of the Message organization. Some of you who are a bit older and who were into those kind of things may remember the Worldwide Message Tribe. It was a Christian, one of the early Christian bands. Well, he was actually involved in that band. And when they broke up, God led him to found this ministry, The Message, which has nothing to do with music. Well, they have some music ministries, but it's essentially an organization that is committed to evangelism, to reaching the lost. They're based in Manchester, though they are actually now worldwide. And they have community work, they have prisons ministry, they set up food banks during COVID, and any way they can to engage with the community, but within that to have opportunities to share the gospel. Because, as I said yesterday evening, social action is one thing, and it's a good and it's a right thing, and it's something that we ought to be involved in as Christian people, because our hearts ought to be for people. Incidentally, we are not just out to save souls. That's not really a good expression. It's a traditional one, traditional language that we've got into, but we want to save people. God is concerned with people. God has a heart for people in their roundedness, their wholeness, their totality. And the Message is concerned with people. But social action on its own is never enough if you don't share Jesus. And as we said last night, you know, that saying, preach the gospel, and if you have to use words is nonsense, because you cannot preach the gospel ultimately without using words. Nobody will ever know about Jesus if we don't mention his name. So we need the words to accompany the things that we're involved in. But the Message has got involved in all kinds of activities from which they have a base to share the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. Well, Andy Hawthorne, some years ago, began to meet with and to mentor a few young evangelists, one of whom happened to be my son, Ben. And their goal was to meet together monthly and to talk together about evangelism, about reaching the lost, and then to encourage one another in witnessing, and to support one another in it, and to make themselves accountable to one another for how they were doing, and to not to criticize, but to support, encourage, and so on. So he set this up. Out of this initial little group came one or two more groups, because his encouragement was for every one of the initial people that he began to meet with to then set up a group of their own and meet with and mentor and encourage others. They have linked with two other big organizations, the Louis Powell organization, which is now based in the States, and the Global Network of Evangelists, which I think is actually linked to Louis Powell, and one or two other organizations as well, and created a whole, I hesitate to use the word movement, and I'm certainly not going to use the word program, because it isn't that, but a whole facility, shall we say, for encouraging people, helping people to share the gospel. Now, the initial people that Andy Hawthorne started with were young, budding evangelists. But this isn't now for, or exclusively for, evangelists. It's spread out to be a foundation for encouraging, supporting Christian believers, people like you and me, people in churches, not with special callings, not with special giftings, but anybody who will, if you like, to get involved in evangelism and to help them to do that, because often we do need help with things. It's grown into a global movement, and they now have advanced groups. I don't want to exaggerate. I was talking to Neil about this last night, how as evangelicals we sometimes exaggerate the numbers because it sounds better. But it is certainly over 100,000 groups, and I think it's well over that are now meeting around the world in, I think it's 90-odd countries. I was on a Zoom call on Thursday this week for an hour with ambassadors from different countries, and there were something like 30 countries around the world represented, from Africa, South America, Asia, and all over. That's the extent to which this movement has spread. And what they've done is they've produced a manual. It's actually, in its totality, a 3-year manual to help equip people and encourage people in evangelism. Now, let me say at this point, I am not going to sell you anything. Well, except I want to sell you the idea, because this is free. Everything that they have produced, and they have produced millions of them now, and they're raising funding to facilitate this and ship these around the world in, I don't know, they're in dozens. Again, I'll not inflate, dozens at least of different languages that this has now been translated into. It's a 3-year manual that helps people meet together and work together, and it's got material that encourages. It's got some directions just to help and stimulate. It's got some basic teaching stuff in there. And the fundamental idea is that people get together and they commit to meet once a month for a couple of hours. It could be in a cafe, it can be anywhere, it's kind of all informal. This is not a program, it's not a church program, it's an individual personal thing. Some churches have taken it on as churches. But the idea is just to stimulate people and help them in witnessing and evangelizing. It only needs somebody who is willing to start a group, and it can be 3-4 people, it might be as much as 10 12 people. You don't want to get too big as a group, because that becomes unwieldy for this purpose. It doesn't need a lot of people. It doesn't need an expert to start it. And that's the beauty of the manual. The manual is designed as a guide, as a help. It is not a program, let me stress, in evangelism, because my son, who now heads this up, is always at pains to say, this is not a program of how to do evangelism. It's a way of helping you to get involved and engaged in evangelism. There's teaching material in there, but it's teaching to provide and help understanding. It's not a how-to manual, because in many ways that doesn't exist, properly speaking. So the material in here is by way of guidance and direction, and a bit of teaching and a bit of help. And it means that if there is, you need to appoint somebody who will be the leader. Somebody needs to start it. But you don't need to have been to Bible college and got 3 degrees in theology before you can kind of get one of these and start a group. Anybody in this room could take this manual and start a group. I really mean that. That's how fundamental and basic it is. Because the heart and passion behind this is that the church becomes re-engaged with evangelism, with witnessing, with reaching out. And this is not about preaching. This is not about holding meetings. It's just helping people to, A, engage with the people that they know, and B, be better informed and equipped, and some ideas and thoughts and support and encouragement to do the kind of casual encounter thing that I mentioned a moment ago, where you're just standing next to somebody. And sometimes it's just having ideas, thoughts. And then the other big issue with the group is the concept of being together. You know, there is something about being together. This is the beauty of corporate worship. None of us in this room ever needs to meet with another Christian in order to be able to worship God. We don't need a special building. We don't need a special place. I can be anywhere I want on my own, and I can worship God. However, there is richness in meeting together. There is encouragement in meeting together. And that's why God had the idea of the church. And incidentally, never forget that the church is God's idea, not ours. And when you're feeling a bit fed up and disillusioned and grumpy about how things, this is God's idea. So you have to say, God, how can I be part of the solution, not the problem? God, how can I help others to better engage and grow in you? And that's why he's put us together, because we are stronger, we are better together. And when I'm down and you're up, you can encourage me and help me. So what's true of worship is also true of something like evangelism. I get older and I think, oh, great, yeah, I'm going to start, I'm going to engage, and I'm going to start to reach out. And my commitment is every week I'm going to seek to share Jesus with somebody. It's very hard to keep going on your own. And when you miss a week and you didn't manage to share with anybody, you start to beat yourself up. And then when the following week you do actually get somebody, but it's a difficult conversation and it ends badly and you think, I messed that up, and you're feeling absolutely down. And you say, I can't do this. I can't be an evangelist, Smalley. I can't be a witness. Well, then you meet together in your monthly meeting and you share how you're feeling, and somebody else is a bit the same and they've had a tough time. And then somebody else says, well, look, this is what God was doing in me this last few weeks. And the sharing together encourages us, makes us stronger. And we pray together. So that's the genius for me behind this concept of just getting, if you like, ordinary people together, meeting together. The primary commitment is to meet together once a month for a couple of hours and work through a session in this guide in the sense that it's there to help, and the material in here is extremely good. I can vouch for. Been very well put together. It's very well presented, and there's pages for notes and things, and they're also now producing a workbook that will go alongside this, all designed to help people engage. Why? Because the people behind this whole movement, we'll call it a movement, have the goal and the sole goal of wanting to engage people in evangelism and to help them in that task. So the primary principles, 5 principles the movement has. The first is regular meeting. So that's what you're committing to. I'm going to meet with these people once a month. The second is sharpening, the idea that by studying together, because there is some helpful study material, you can be deepened and grow. It's deep, but it's not deep, if you know what I mean. It's well written, well produced in ways that engage with some of the areas that will come up. Some of the material is kind of a bit of theology, make sure we understand the gospel a little bit better. Some of it's very practical stuff. Where do we get our power from? Talks about prayer and sessions on a whole variety of things. There's accountability, which I've already mentioned. The fact that when people meet together, they can talk about where they're at in an open way without being critical of one another, in that context where there's a safety, a security, but an ability to share and therefore be accountable, even if it's coming to say, you know what, this last month I've really messed up. I haven't spoken to anybody at all. Without somebody jumping on you. Really? Really? Well, what are you doing? Why have you bothered coming? No, it's okay. Well, why was that? Let's talk about this together, and let's pray for you and pray that God will just help you this next month to, so on. And then communication, keeping up to date with gospel opportunities and so on. And then the last one is interesting, that the core value, multiplication, because the idea is that people spend time in a group and go through, and then they'll even start to form their own groups. You just imagine, if you start with 5 groups, and you've got 5 people, let's say, and that's 25 people, and a year, 2 years down the road, they split up, and each one forms a group. 25 groups suddenly becomes 125 groups, and so you go and you multiply, and the goal is, without any precision of that kind, and you'll never get the full carry through, 5 people, every single person does, but if you get 3 out of that group that do, then you've got this goal of ultimate multiplication. So hopefully I've explained that well and given you some sense of the heart behind this, but more than that, a sense of maybe I can think about this. Now, the beauty is you're only making a commitment to yourself, well, to God obviously first, to yourself and to the other people you meet with. There's no wider program. You can register your group, and that just helps the organization to be able to feed material in. Nobody will check up on you. Nobody will keep tabs on where you're at. But there is the possibility to say, maybe I can try this, Lord. Maybe I can have a go and begin to meet with a few other people. Now, I stress that all of this material is available free of charge. I mean, this is quite some manual that's been produced, and you could easily pay £10 for a manual like this. Everything is free. Nobody is looking to make money in this. It's costing the organization. They're looking to God. God is providing funds, and they're producing this stuff. Now, this manual, which is the full manual, I think this is the 3-year version of the manual. Yeah, it is. We're getting to 3. So this is the full 3-year manual. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, you can set out on the journey, and it doesn't mean you have to keep going for 3 years. You can develop in other ways, other directions. There's no commitment at all other than to one another within the group in that regard. These manuals were being sent out in hard copy free of charge. They're pulling back from that now in terms of obviously costings and so on, and going more digital. It is free online. There is a website, advancedgroups.org. If anyone wants to write it, it's a single word, advancedgroups.org. You can go on the website, you can see further information, you can ask for a manual and whatever, and as I said, there are no costs anywhere, no charges anywhere. You may still be able to get hard copies, because it's a kind of phased switchover, but in order to be more effective and in order to get this out in more places around the world, they're focusing more on the digital production rather than the costs of obviously producing hard copies. But if anyone is interested to pursue this, you can go online and you'll see whether hard copies are available. So you can certainly get the digital copies free of charge. Let me add one other thing, and that's that I have got a number of, I've got about a dozen of these taster guides. It is a kind of introduction, and I think you've got the first 3 sessions of the first year in here. I haven't got enough to give everybody one. They are actually available, and again, you can go online, and this will be available online. And I didn't have enough with me, and it would have been a lot to carry as well. So I'm going to leave these out, make these available, and can I just say, if you feel seriously interested in maybe you will do this. You're not signing up, and I don't need to know anything. You just come to. Feel free to come and take a copy. Or if you feel God is prompting you, something in your heart, even if in the end you don't, that's okay. Nobody will ever know. But please just don't take one. Oh, that's quite interesting. I'll be interested to have a look at that, because I'd rather that the people who seriously might engage get the first dibs on them. If they all go, advancedgroups.org is the website, and you can readily get material available from them. I will leave this copy of the full advance guide if anybody wants to have a quick glance and look, although any who get this, that you'll get the idea from the taster guide. I'm then going to leave this with Neil, so Neil will have a copy of this. Let me stress, I am not here to promote an organization. My son Ben heads it up. He has no heart to promote an organization in that sense. He has one passion and desire, and that's that people should know about Jesus Christ. And he believes his calling is to help Christians be better equipped, in a better place to be able to engage in witnessing, in sharing Jesus with others. So that's why I've taken time to share that. Now, obviously, you don't need any of that just to go and be a witness. Anybody in this room, we all should be witnessing. You might want to think to yourself on the back of, declaring God's glory in the church and in the world. You know what? I need to recommit myself to sharing the good news about Jesus Christ. So, Lord, I'm going to commit to aim to share Jesus with one person, at least one person, every month. Maybe every week. Maybe this week. It's being intentional. If we're not intentional, we'll never do it. We'll never get there. If you set those sorts of targets, you need to understand it's not about beating ourselves up if we don't get there. It's about being intentional, about wanting to try. And it's one of those things that the more we do, the easier in some ways it becomes, the more natural. It can be awkward sometimes, it can be difficult. But as it becomes a regular part of our life and of our lifestyle, an outworking of our worship of God, in witnessing to him and sharing the good news about Jesus Christ, what a glorious thing that would be. And we would ourselves, in the process, become better worshippers, if you like, or worshippers more approved of God, and whose worship is more acceptable to God, but we would also be engaging with him in his mission of making worshippers. And that's why I take time to share this with you. The reason I've gone for the advance is partly because I'm involved relatively loosely, but I'm involved with them. I'm doing some editing and writing work for them and so on. So I'm aware of it, and that's why I have it on my heart to share. My current commitment is wherever I go and have the opportunity, I'm going to share about Advance and seek to get more people engaged in evangelism. And notice, in evangelism, not in Advance. If you go away from here today enthused, praying, seeking God to be more intentional about evangelism, don't care about Advance. That's the kind of secondary thing. It's just a means to an end. It's a tool. But if that does prove to be in any way helpful, then be aware of it and be ready to make use of it. So, declaring God's glory in the church and in the world. And if I can quote John Piper again, in the same book, he writes, the most crucial issue in missions, or evangelism if you prefer, is the centrality of God in the life of the church. How can people who are not stunned by the greatness of God be sent with the ringing message of Psalm 96:4, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, he is to be feared above all gods. So my final reflection, I just want to come back to our worship of God because it's central to everything else. Not to remake the point that we need to make sure we worship God, but we need to make sure we know the God that we worship. And that takes us back to his revelation of himself in the Bible. And the better we know our God, the more ready we will be, the more able we will be to worship, and the more ready we will be to share him and witness to him. As Piper writes here, how can people who are not stunned by the greatness of God be sent with the ringing message, great is the Lord? So the more we see of God and his greatness, the more passionate we are going to be to share him with others. So this isn't about working up some passion. It's about grounding ourselves in a true knowledge of God, understanding him for who he is, not who we make him. You know what one of the great problems for us as Christians is? It's a kind of idolatry that fashions a God after our own thinking. And it's unbelievably easy to do. That without realizing it, without intending it, we kind of create in our minds a God that is in effect a God of our own making. Some years ago, a guy called J.B. Phillips, who was best known for writing a paraphrase or producing a paraphrase of the New Testament, J.B. Phillips' New Testament. That was years ago now. It's not so widely used, you may well not know of it. But J.B. Phillips, he wrote a book, the title of which is Your God is Too Small. And it's a brilliant book. It's a powerful book because it points out how, for many of us, we've reduced God to our level. We've created a God in our own image. How pathetic is that? Because a God in my image really isn't worth worshipping or following, and he can do nothing for me. But without realizing it, we do it. And actually, some years after Philip's book, another guy, John Young, came along, and he wrote a book, Our God is Still Too Small. It was kind of a parody of Philip's saying, look, folks, we still haven't got this. One of my all-time to-read Christian books is Jim Packer's Knowing God. It's one of the best bits of theology ever written, and in my view, every Christian ought to try and read it. It is so good. It's brilliant. And it basically is a study, a very readable, devotional study of God. Jim Packer, Knowing God. But he writes in the foreword to that book that one of our problems is that we suffer from amnesia in relation to a knowledge and understanding of God. And our loss of vision of God and who he is has impacted almost everything else that we are and everything else that we do. So the greatest thing we need to do is renew our vision and understanding of God. And if we're going to declare his glory in worship, in evangelism, we need to know his glory. We need to appreciate his glory. We need, if I may say, to be blown away by his glory. We need to be overwhelmed by his glory. We need to be humbled by his glory. And the more we come to a true understanding of God, the more meaningful and true will be our declarations of his glory, both in the church and in the world. And may everything we do in worship and evangelism be to his glory. I'm going to finish up tomorrow morning in the service with a sermon that will hopefully round things up based on 1 Peter 2, which is a glorious passage, but we'll come to that tomorrow morning.